application for some type of visa, such as a B visa or a student visa. The second path to U.S. entry is obviously migration, called immigrant travel. It's travel here on a permanent basis through permanent residency. The top priority of family member that's granted immediate status in the U.S. is immediate relatives of U.S. citizens. There is an unlimited amount of visas available for these categories, so as soon as you apply, a visa is made available, and on average it takes about 4 to 6 months to process, which, if you know anything about immigration benefits, that's actually not a very long timeline at all. The second type of family category is what's called the family preference categories. I'm not going to go through all of these. You can just take a quick look and see. I will say that a lot of these, the timeline for them can range anywhere from 5 to 10 years. So if you or someone you know thinks they might be eligible for one of these benefits, it's in your best interest to start getting your documents together, start discussing your options with your family, and speak with someone as soon as possible to get the ball rolling on an application if you might be eligible. Very briefly about refugee and asylee status. The only difference between the two is the mechanism by which you apply for them. Refugee status obviously is obtained while you're out of the country, whereas asylee status is obtained when you're inside the U.S. or you're at a port of entry. Regardless of either one, they both have the same standard of proof, as you can see, to show inability or unwillingness to return due to persecution or well-founded fear of persecution based on religion, nationality, race, political opinion, membership in a particular social group. Now I want to talk about some of the policy changes we've seen in the last year. There has not been a significant change to U.S. immigration law until 1990, the likes of which we're seeing right now. And I know that a lot of people are kind of confused about what's going on, and a lot of the executive orders that President Trump is passing, they don't have a lot of clarity to them, and sometimes there's just pages and pages of legalese. So just in an effort to break them down a little bit, the first one he passed, called Enhancing Public Safety in the Interior of the United States, in January 25th of last year. This, I'm sure, as you all have heard in the news, was the executive order that withheld funding for jurisdictions and states that called themselves sanctuary cities. And basically, sanctuary cities are just that these regions who have said that they're not willing to cooperate with federal immigration authorities in trying to find people who are undocumented or may be removable. As you can see, it also called for some enforcement implementations and 10,000 additional ICE officers for enforcement of immigration laws. The next one, border security and immigration enforcement improvements. This one is the one that implemented Trump's policy on building the wall with Mexico. Now, in the most recent spending bill that was passed, there was about $1.6 billion allotted for research and things of that nature. But as of this week, there haven't been any actual moves to start building. And as of right now, the only plans are to reinforce existing borders that are already up between us and Mexico. So another aspect of this executive order is increasing detention facilities and certain asylum personnel near the U.S.-Mexico border, the idea being to try to catch people who are coming across and give them quick hearings to possibly remove them if they're not eligible to stay. The next one, protecting the nation from foreign terrorist entry into the U.S. This is the executive order that triggered the travel ban last year that caused all the chaos. Now, this executive order has gone through 2 or 3 changes, but I think it's important to go through each iteration of it to understand the progress of the policy and where the Trump administration might be going in passing new immigration laws. The original travel ban, as some of you may know, was a 90-day ban on travel from the citizens of the countries you see listed here, and the suspension of the U.S. refugee program, as well as the suspension of the visa waiver program. The visa waiver program is an agreement the U.S. has with governments all over the world where you don't have to apply for a visa, or in some cases, it's very limited circumstances you need to apply for a visa to stimulate free travel between the countries. The next version of the travel ban was passed because the first version was struck down in court. So in an effort to get it passed, President Trump in the next iteration simply removed Iraq from the list of travel banned countries and made it a point to point out that it was only applicable to new visa applicants. I'm sure some of you saw in the news the executive order passed while some people who already had visas were in the air coming to the U.S. And when they land in the airport, they find out they're all of a sudden not eligible to enter the U.S. So it created chaos. They even went as far as banning permanent residents. So it created a lot of problems. And fortunately, there were a lot of organizations and immigrant rights groups that filed lawsuits almost immediately and enjoined the enforcement of this executive order. The next to last version created not so much a ban, but country-specific travel restrictions on the countries you see listed here. And then the next version of the ban simply removed Chad from the list of travel-restricted countries. I don't know if you all saw, but actually just yesterday, the U.S. Supreme Court heard arguments from the government and immigrant rights groups on the travel ban. We probably won't have a decision on it until June, and unfortunately, I read the arguments, and there's really no way to tell which way the court is leaning. There are some justices that are siding with Trump's authority to do this, and there are some that point out he's going beyond constitutional bounds. We won't have any clear clarity, obviously, until we get the decision in June. So, now, just to talk about more general policy provisions. In October 24, 2017, President Trump announced that all refugees would now be permitted to enter, but with the new vetting procedures that he was required to implement while the ban was in place. Some of the requirements are more biographical data from refugees and even a review of your social media activity. So it's important to understand if you or your family members, if you think they might be eligible for refugee status or might be coming here for refugee status, to let them know that their social media might be subject to review. More on the enhanced refugee measures. And on January this year, the administration announced new screening requirements for 11 countries they consider high-risk countries. They haven't come out and publicly announced which countries these actually are, but according to Refugee USA Council, this is an immigrants' rights group, they're responsible for placing refugees throughout the United States. They've narrowed it down to these countries you see listed here. And there's a policy provision within that that says the administration every 6 months will go back over this list and go back through their security measures and from time to time modify it. So there's a chance some of these countries could be removed, some countries could be added. We'll know every 6 months, unfortunately, but as you can see, it creates a very volatile situation for anyone that might be trying to plan travel to the U.S. There are new visa requirements for anyone that's applying for any type of visa. As you can see, visa holders will be required to abide by their intended plans for at least 3 months. The original policy was if you came to the U.S. on a visa and then something happened in your circumstances where, for example, you might decide to take up a course of study or you meet someone you want to marry. You change your intended plans, and with that, you file an application to change your status. Well, now the Department of State has made it clear that if you change your intentions within a 3-month window instead of a 1-month window, your application will not only be rejected, but you'll be subject to removal proceedings. So it's very important if you have family members, anyone applying for any type of visa and they want to come here, make it very clear to them they cannot stray from the intentions of their visa when they first get here. It can very dire consequences. It can even result in a ban from them coming back to the U.S. indefinitely. There's also a new prioritization for asylum applications. Recently, actually in 2017, we saw a record low border crossings between the U.S. and Mexico, but this policy measure was kind of in the making for 2 years to address a surge in Central American and Mexican floods across the border. So in order to kind of curtail that, the U.S. government set up a lot of resources at the border to start doing what they call credible fear determinations. And basically what that is, it's a very short interview to determine whether or not you're eligible for asylum. And if you're not, then they will initiate immediate removal proceedings. A lot of times they'll cut corners on due process simply because they're setting up interview centers in satellite camps across the Mexican border. So it's not really conducive to due process or your rights and things you typically be afforded in a hearing when you have time to prepare with your lawyer. The prioritization It requires USCIS to process asylum applications that have been pending for 21 days or less, or if your interview had to be rescheduled. Now, I will say this, if your refugee or asylum application, if you've already reached the interview point in that application, then it looks like you're safe from a policy perspective. They'll continue processing your application because the interview is where they issue the decision on your application. So there's no need to reprioritize those. This is simply for the newer applications to try to beat back the backlog because it's built up so much in the last year. A couple weeks ago, there was a Supreme Court case which has actually been going on since the Obama administration. But it's a very huge step in immigration law, and actually it will probably have an effect on every type of immigration application that's filed from hereafter. If you or your family has ever filed an immigrant petition, I'm sure you understand that one of the things they ask you is for your criminal history. And it can be the #1 bar to you getting any type of immigration benefit that you might be eligible for. Well, the case, as you can see, Sessions v. DeMaya, involved a gentleman in California who was arrested for 2 burglary charges, which California law considered crimes of violence. Under immigration law before this decision, any crime of violence which was deemed containing factors of aggravated felonies, it would either get you kicked out of the U.S. or make you ineligible for an immigration benefit. Well, I'm sure some of you know, after Justice Scalia passed away, there was a while where the Supreme Court was hearing arguments with just 8 justices. They heard this case last year and ended up in a 4-4 tie. So they scheduled it for hearings this year when they would have a justice to break the tie. And sure enough, Trump's appointment to the bench actually went in favor against the government and ruled that that was unconstitutionally vague. So now there are certain classes of immigrants that are now eligible for benefits that weren't before for simple things like misdemeanors. In even some states, traffic tickets were enough to keep you from giving an immigration benefit. It just depends on what the state law dictates that the severity of that law is. So this is a huge step in that regard, and I imagine that it will lead to more and more people seeking immigration benefits that wouldn't otherwise do so before. The very same day this ruling came out, a resolution was passed in the House by a Republican senator. It's called the Queen of the Hill resolution. What the Queen of the Hill resolution is basically, if there's a gridlock in the House, a member can pass a resolution that requires the floor to take up a vote on up to 4 bills. And whichever bill gets the most votes wins. So that resolution right now, they're trying to gain traction in Congress, and it looks like they're going to have the votes to pass it, but we'll see. That remains to be seen. The 4 bills, and we'll talk more about those here in a little bit, are the DREAM Act, Securing America's Future Act, USA Act, and a bill of Speaker Paul Ryan's choosing. Now, just briefly on DAPA and DACA, unfortunately, deferred action for parents of American citizens was a benefit created by Obama to help parents of American citizens who didn't otherwise have immigration benefits. But as you can see, in June of 2017, President Trump rescinded DAPA, so it's no longer available in any form. But just 2 days ago, a DC federal judge ruled that President Trump not only had to continue processing renewal applications for DACA, but that he had to accept new ones, which was a huge departure from the challenges that the previous DACA iterations have received. So now, the judge has given the Department of Homeland Security 90 days to come up with a more valid justification for ending DACA, and if it doesn't, DACA will go into full effect. So I'll say this, if you think anybody might be eligible for DACA that you know, it's important for them to start planning now in the event that at the end of the 90 days, the plan goes into effect. Because there's going to be a flood of applications, we're probably going to see another backlog, and it's going to take a while to process these applications. And even now, while the 90 days goes on, while DHS has time to respond, USCIS is still required to accept renewal applications. So if you're an existing DACA holder, you can apply to extend your benefits, regardless of the court ruling. Just briefly on DACA eligibility requirements, as you can see right here, I'm not going to go through all these again, but I can make this information available to anyone that wants it, so you can have it in front of you and help yourself out or help out a family member if you want. But again, it is in your best interest to, if you think you might be eligible for DACA or know someone that is, to start getting things together and start planning right now. Temporary protected status. This was another benefit created for temporary relief for people who are already in the U.S. Certain countries designated by the Department of Homeland Security for protections, for conflict zones, for zones experiencing a public health crisis, were given temporary work authorizations and permission to stay in the U.S. until conditions in their country improved. As of this year, the Trump administration rescinded TPS designation for Haiti, Nicaragua, El Salvador, and the Sudan, but it's been extended for Syria and South Sudan. So if someone is currently in the country that thinks they might not be eligible for another immigration benefit, this might be something that can assist you. Now, to talk a little about some proposals. These aren't laws that haven't necessarily been introduced yet, but there are bills that are gaining traction in Congress, and there hasn't been any immigration reform passed or any immigration changes of any substantive nature in a while, so it looks like we're getting ready to see something like that soon. So I'll just talk briefly about these to kind of see where the administration might be going. These are the bills they're going to be taking up in the Queens of the Hill resolution. The first one, Reforming American Immigration for a Strong Economy Act. This was a proposal by Senator Tom Cotton to shift the visa process to a points-based system. And basically how it works is you provide your credentials, you provide your education, you provide your work history, and each one of those aspects creates a point value. And you accumulate all these points, and the people with the most points will be invited by USCIS to apply for visas. The second one, Securing America's Future, this is referred to as the Goodlatte bill. This is actually the bill that's gaining the most traction among Republicans in Congress. It calls for 3-year renewable permits to live and work in the U.S., but unfortunately it doesn't create any new paths to citizenship. And if you know anything about immigration law, you know that there's already very few paths to citizenship as it is, and there were hopes that this administration, or at least this Congress, would open that window, but it doesn't look like that's going to happen. United and Securing America Act, this calls for an 8-year renewable conditional permanent residency and pathway to citizenship for DACA benefits, for DACA beneficiaries. This is President Trump's proposed immigration framework. Now this, again, has not been introduced or anything. This was just something that he introduced to Congress with the hopes that they might pass their own comprehensive package for him to sign. Some of the main highlights of this, as you can see, is a path to citizenship for DACA recipients, but unfortunately it's a 10 to 12-year path. He hasn't specifically explained what would have to happen over that 10 to 12-year path, but all indications indicate you have to be pursuing some type of degree, stay out of trouble, and things of that nature. It also calls for limits on chain migration and family-based immigration, particularly for parents and siblings of U.S. citizens, and the elimination of the diversity immigrant visa program. That program provides 50,000 visas a year to countries that are underrepresented in the U.S. Trump has long said that that is the source of terrorist travel into the U.S., and that's been one of the hallmarks of his administration, is trying to get rid of that program. I can tell you right now that any visa, any immigration overhaul that he is willing to sign is going to include concessions on DACA and the elimination of this program. Now I want to talk a little bit about the rights that certain undocumented immigrants have. Contrary to what you might have heard, you do have rights in this country whether or not you're a citizen. The Immigration and Customs Enforcement has been stepping up enforcement efforts recently. I'm sure you've read in the news right here in West Virginia. Every other week I read about a raid in southern West Virginia. They've been targeting certain restaurants. In Huntington, there was actually a case. There was 4 ICE agents that went to eat lunch at a Mexican restaurant, and then when they finished eating lunch, they went into the kitchen and arrested everybody. So they're not ashamed at all in their tactics. As you can see here, they're employing some pretty shady practices. Real briefly on using ICE warrants. ICE does not have the authority to issue a warrant. This is purely an administrative document. It's what they use when they can't get a judge to sign a warrant for them. So if ICE ever comes to you with a warrant that's signed by an ICE agent, it's pretty much useless. It's just a way to intimidate you into giving them access to something they wouldn't normally have access to. seeking consensual searches. This is a tactic they'll use where they'll approach you in a friendly way and try to make it seem like they're trying to gain information on something that's not related to your immigration status, and basically get you to forfeit your Fourth Amendment rights to unreasonable search and seizure. So don't be fooled by it. And also conducting Terry stops. Terry stops are basically brief detentions that law enforcement agents can make that are below the probable cause threshold they need to meet. So obviously, if they just have an inkling that you might be doing something wrong, they can use it as an excuse to stop you, look through your paperwork, and see if you have any evidence of being an undocumented immigrant and possibly subject to removal. So, some situations, if ICE ever comes to your home, if you're an undocumented immigrant, and again, I'm not advocating, I just want to make you aware of your rights. You do not have to let them inside. You don't have to show them anything or sign anything they put in front of you. And if they do come to your door, you should always ask them to identify themselves. Recently, ICE has been contracting local law enforcement to implement immigration laws for them. In Huntington, they've contracted